I would be happy to respond to some questions. Yes, sir.
Professor Summers, very persuasive, articulate argument. Those of us who are privileged and lucky enough to be in this room, what should we be doing rather than waiting for government?
Well, if you accept my argument, it probably has implications for how you cast your vote. And it probably has implications for what kinds of political activity that you engage in. And it probably has implications for some types of activities that operate to subvert the system, that some engage in, that one should perhaps desist from. But I think the other implication of this argument is that, and it's not something I had a chance to develop, is that there's enormous scope in all our societies for what the first President Bush in the United States used to call 1,000 points of light. Participation in a whole range of non-governmental activities, whether it's support for a school, whether it's establishment of community centers like this. I don't know whether there is any effort made to give out tickets to events like this one to people for whom the opportunity to participate might be meaningful, but for whom the cost of a ticket isn't a realistic aspiration. But it's an example of the kind of thing that fosters greater cohesion in a society. Yes?
You mentioned the deflationary spiral. Do you think over the short term in the UK there could be a positive implication?
One wants to use words a little bit carefully here. I think that a decline in oil prices is a good thing. Not a good thing for everybody, but I think in aggregate, a decline in oil prices is a good thing. It raises people's real income, gives them a capacity to spend more, pushes economies forward. So insofar as, the price of oil has come down because people have found more oil, or the price of smartphones have come down because Moore's Law lets people produce better semiconductors, I think that's a good thing. I think that when you're talking about a systematic and across-the-board decline in prices, experience suggests that sustained periods of deflation are rarely periods of sustained prosperity. And so I think that's likely to be an unhealthy thing, in part because it leads to effects where people decide that things are going to be cheaper next year, and so they wait to buy, and then as everybody waits to buy, nobody spends, and then incomes are lower and people are poorer. So I would be rather skeptical of the idea that sustained deflation was economically advantageous. Yes.
How do you think China will affect the economy if they're going down?
My guess is that the Chinese economy will grow significantly less rapidly over the next decade than it has over the last 2 decades. I think there's a general tendency towards what statisticians call mean reversion in growth rates. People tend to forecast growth by assuming that what happened in the last decade will happen in the next decade. And as the mutual fund prospectus says, past performance is no guarantee of future performance. So my guess is that the Chinese growth will slow somewhat, but I think China is obviously going to be a very important presence for commodity markets and a very, very important presence for manufacturers. I suspect the world is not going to tolerate the kind of growth in manufacturing exports from China that we've seen in the last 20 years. Yeah.
In order to achieve inclusive prosperity over the middle class or resolve inequality if imposing tax on the wealthy is not the most efficient way? What do you think alternatives?
No, I don't think I said that we shouldn't impose taxes on the wealthy. I think I said we shouldn't impose taxes on the wealthy for the sake of tearing them down. I think I said that it was important to create an environment in which progressive taxation was possible, and that meant that if you had an environment where it was easy to escape progressive taxation by using various techniques to place your income in a different country, then we wouldn't succeed in having effectively progressive taxation. But I think there's a very strong economic case for progressive taxation, and probably for more progressive taxation than exists in many countries. I think there's also scope for looking at corporate governance procedures and compensation practices. I think there are probably some instances in which corporate governance practices permit compensation that's probably in excess of contribution. But in general, in a market economy, I think it's usually best not to try to decide what the level of different people's income should be, but to rely more on progressive taxation as an approach to mobilizing government revenue on the basis of ability to pay. Yeah.
Professor Summers, when you cast the problem of income inequality from the perspective of the industrialized economies, it's clearly a very big challenge. But when you look at it from a global perspective, can't you make the case that the last 20 years have been about a great income convergence between a rising middle class in particularly Asia and the sort of more poor fortunes of the middle class in the industrialized economies? And really, are there ways where you can avoid that and reduce the divergence in the industrialized economies without also frustrating this great convergence, which must be something which is a great contribution in the global good to helping ensure that we have a peaceful global society? In other words, that maybe when seen on a global stage, the maintaining stagnant incomes in the developed economies is actually a good price to pay if the benefit of that is a massive increase in incomes in Asia.
I think that it would be a very difficult moral question where you certainly would have a very strong argument if I believed that there was a trade-off where somehow the cost of having a reduction in inequality in the United Kingdom and the United States was much less convergence on the part of India and China and other Asian countries. Which was more important for us? That'd be a very, very difficult question. But I don't believe for a moment that anything like that trade-off exists. Nothing in the agenda that I suggested of infrastructure investment, of promotion of private investment, of establishment of more progressive taxation, of protecting the rights of labor, of achieving greater international cooperation. None of that ran any risk of thwarting the growth of India and China. To the extent that it produced better economic performance in our countries and more rapidly growing performance in our countries, which I believe it would only increase their demand for the exports of China and India and pull them along faster. So I don't take that as a trade-off that actually exists. I agree very much with you on the moral significance for humanity of the convergence that's taken place. And I think it's something very much to be celebrated. But I don't think it vitiates my argument about there being significant problems that need to be addressed within industrial democracies. And while I'm sure this was not your intent at all or your perspective, I do note that there are some on the right who have traditionally been largely without concern for development assistance, who seize on this convergence that you refer to as an argument against being concerned with inequality within our countries. And I don't think that inequality within our countries is an absent concern because of the progress that's taken place in China and India. Yeah.
Professor Summers, as the machines get inexorably better and human labor finds it more and more difficult to compete with the machines, in the long term, aren't we going to end up with governments just giving out pocket money?
I think it is a natural concomitant of a world in which there may be more and more capacity for the rewards to go to fewer and fewer people who are good at designing things, and more people whose productivity is quite low, that you may see a need for alternative economic arrangements. Look, let's put it, it's not like this is a historically unknown thing. Think about 12-year-olds. 300 years ago, 12-year-olds basically worked to support themselves, and that's how they earned and that's how they ate, by working. And today, in the industrial world, 12-year-olds probably couldn't earn very much, even if they went to work, and the society is far more richer, and so there's a kind of social expectation that 12-year-olds are taken care of in a different way by their work. And similarly, our society is in a different place than it was on those in the late stage of life. There is no longer an expectation that they will be taken care of by their own work. And I suspect there is the possibility, perhaps even the likelihood, that the circle of people who will be supported in ways other than their own work proximately will increase with the passage of time. As the example of 12-year-olds suggests, this may not be an entirely unfortunate development, and it may have some significantly positive aspects, but it's the kind of thing I had in mind when I remarked on the ways in which this revolution was going to require substantial change in institutions in the same way that the Industrial Revolution had required.